Welcome to the Section 2 lecture of Chapter 31, and this section is about the American economic development. And the most important development in this chapter is going to be about migration and the migration to the Americas. So this is actually one of the major concepts in this unit for AP World History, is understanding the causes and the effects of migrations. And the biggest migrations to take place in this era were the migrations to the Americas from Europe and from Asia for the large part. And this is going to be the base of the economic development of the Americas, because this is going to be a mass migration unlike any migration that had ever occurred before. It was the largest migration to ever happen up to this point in history. And so European and Asian people migrated in masses to the United States, to Canada, and to Latin America. And Latin Americans migrate to the United States. So from Latin America to the US, you may have heard people call the United States a country of immigrants or a land of immigrants, or how the United States was made by immigrants. And so that is very true. You have people coming over, and there was a series of, whenever there's migrations, there's push factors and pull factors. There are reasons people leave their countries, and there are reasons they get pulled to certain countries. So people were leaving their countries for different reasons: political problems, economic instability, economic hardships, famine. But what pulls them to the United States is this newly growing industrial economy, and they get pulled to Latin American countries for agricultural work. But all of this is associated with the Industrial Revolution and industrialization. In 1849, the gold rush is going to open up a lot of the United States to a lot of immigrants from China going to the west coast of the United States. And this is going to fuel the population growth of the 19th and 20th centuries in the Americas. So the first types of migrants that come are what are called industrial migrants. So there's two types of migrants. The first are industrial migrants. These are immigrants who filled the factories that were developing, and by having a constant flow of immigration, it kept the wages low. It kept costs low for production, and that allowed countries like the United States and Canada to experience an economic boom. Whenever there is a lot of people looking for work, businesses are able to offer, they don't have to offer high wages because there's so many people that need work, and so that kept the costs low. By the 1850s, there was 2.3 million European immigrants from Germany, from Ireland, Scandinavia, and from Scotland. And then in the 1880s, you started seeing Eastern and Southern Europeans, so more Italians, Greeks, Russians, Poles coming to the United States. So there have been different waves of immigrants that were coming. And Chinese immigrants a lot of times came as indentured labor contracts. The Chinese government, the Qing dynasty, allowed Chinese businessmen to indenture laborers and bring them to the Americas to work for them. A lot of them went to California for the gold rush, right? This is why there's a big Chinatown in San Francisco. There's a big Chinatown in Vancouver, Canada, which is also on the West Coast, where they also went for mining operations. And that is one of the impacts of this slavery, is the creation of these ethnic enclaves like Little Italy, Chinatown, etc. And then during the Mexican Revolution in 1980, you're going to start to see a large migration of Mexicans moving to the United States. About 10% of Mexican people left Mexico during the Revolution and came to the growing development of the U.S. economy. And we'll study that in the later chapter. And then you had plantation migrants, okay? And these largely were going to Latin America. There were 4 million Italians who went to Argentina. The abolition of slavery, after the independence and the abolition of slavery, led to a lot of labor shortages all over Latin America. The Brazilian government, which was the last government to outlaw slavery, it began to pay to bring Italian immigrants to go work in the coffee fields because once they got rid of slavery and they didn't rely on the free labor, there were labor shortages. So the abolition of slavery plays a role in why there's a big demand. Asian immigrants went to the Caribbean, to Peru, and to Hawaii. Okay? And so places that had agricultural economies are the places that these migrants came from. So, for example, when Italians migrated to the Americas, Italians that came from northern Italy, which was more industrialized places like Milan, they were going to the United States. But immigrants that were from the southern parts, from Naples and other more agricultural areas, a lot of them went to Latin America because you're going to do the type of work you did back home, but with more opportunities. And so you might have, heard, and I'll talk a little bit about this in class, where, some of the descendants today, the names of places. If anybody's a fan of Soda Stereo, there's Gustavo Cerati, or if you're a soccer fan, Lionel Messi. These are Italian names, but they're people from Argentina. There was a president, Alberto Fujimori, right, a Japanese name, who was the president of Chile. Or no, sorry, not Chile. He was the president of Peru. And so that's one of the impacts, the long-term impacts of these migrations. So migrations fuel the growth of and the economic expansion of the Americas and in the United States. The other thing that played a role besides the immigration in the economic expansion of the Americas and the US and Canada, and had an influence, was British investment and British capital. So two big developments. One, migration, and the other is British capital. Remember, England was the first country to industrialize. And after independence, it maintained ties with the Americans. It maintained ties with the Canadians because these were British citizens here, right? And so they had their connections already. They maintained those, and they invested in the U.S. economy. So they saw the potential of the U.S. economy, so they invested a lot of money here and helped it develop its textile industry, setting up textile mills, funding coal and iron ore mines, building factories, building railroads. And then eventually, because the U.S. has much more land and resources than England, it eventually outperforms Britain in Britain's industrial production. The most important economic developments were the railroads. And the railroads linked the U.S. regions. It allowed the connection between areas of the country that were rich in minerals that were needed for industrialization and places that had the transportation hubs and the hubs of population. So it connects the resources with the markets. It fuels other industries, okay? Because in order to build railroad, we need timber. So it's going to lead to the logging industry. We're going to need mining iron. It's going to lead to more mining. We're going to need to build stations, and cities are going to grow up. It's going to lead to construction and everything else that goes along with it. So this creates a cheap transportation network that allows the big expanse of the United States to be connected, because that was one of the advantages early on of England's industrialization, the fact that it was small and it was connected by rivers. Well, the U.S. is much larger and doesn't have as many rivers to connect it, but the railroads allowed for that connection to occur. And that's what became, and pretty soon railroad development becomes a symbol of industrialization. The more industrialized you were, the more railroads crisscrossed your nation. And the railroad companies and the barons became very, very rich. We still see the legacies. Two of the big railroad families were the families of Andrew Carnegie and Leland Stanford, of course, using the proceeds of a lot of their businesses to fund universities like Carnegie Mellon out in the East Coast and Stanford here in California. So the railroads altered the landscape, right? It brought, towns where nothing had existed before. So towns popped up along railroads. the companies would buy land very cheaply and then run the railroad through there and then develop the land and sell it off. They exploited natural resources. It led to the clearing of land, so it made westward expansion more possible. And now that you can get to places faster, it opened up new farmland, and more people went west for farming. It also contributes to pollution. And then we even get the time standards. The reason we have standard time, Pacific Standard Time, Central Standard Time, etc., is because prior to this, everywhere you went kind of kept their own time. And what was 12 o'clock here in San Diego, in LA, they might have been saying it's 12:40. And in San Francisco, they might have been saying it's, 12:45. And in Arizona, it could have been 2 o'clock, right? So there was no sense of a common time. You had your clock in the middle of the town, and that's when you knew the time. Well, once you have a railroad and you're connecting everything, you have to sync up schedules of when things come and go. So you have to create some kind of a standard time, and that's where we got our time zones from. So the United States expands, and another factor is there's a lot of different inventions, things like the cotton gin. Eventually, we get things like the light bulb coming out of the United States. So as more goods become available and cheaper, there's more consumer demand. And so it's going to be a continual progress. There's going to be constant growth because there's going to be a growing population who have jobs, who are making money, who are going to want to buy goods. So that's going to fuel demand. There's going to be inventions that lead to making goods faster. That's going to make them easier to make. And so all of this is going to lead to the United States becoming pretty soon a very powerful industrial country. And so things like electricity and then pretty much, photography, the electric motor, all of these begin to appear and people begin to want these products. However, there was opposition to this. Labor unions often opposed the conditions, just like what you read about in chapter 30, right? You had labor strikes, you had a lot of attempts to shut down the railroads. There was a lot of violence because of labor unions and strikes. So it wasn't all just easy, but those were some of the challenges that came along with the economic growth. And then Canada also experiences economic prosperity similar to the United States because of British investment. So the Britain invested heavily into Canada, right? They wanted to develop Canada as well. They had maintained their ties to Canada. In fact, Canada was still part of, the British Empire in some way. So the economy still fell under British control. During the 19th century, right, it would pay high prices for agricultural products and minerals that came, from Canada to keep Canada stable and to discourage separatist movements. So it also put protective tariffs on products. Canada also begins to attract immigrants. Its growing economy and its high-paying jobs also attract immigrants into Canada. And like the United States, they build a railroad. So after the establishment of the Canadian Dominion, right, when Canada gets the right to rule itself, politicians started a program of economic development they called the National Policy. And the idea was to attract migrants so that they could protect these industries through tariffs and build up these transportation systems. And then later on, pretty soon, Canada starts to become very wealthy in some areas. Okay, it's going to see a booming agricultural economy, a booming mining economy, industrial production by the late 19th centuries and early in the 20th century. Their population is going to grow because of the migration and because of natural increase. So people are going to go from Asia and then from Europe. So there was about 2.7 million Eastern European immigrants that went to Canada. And it also, even though it remained wary of the United States, it also began to become an economic trading partner with the United States, and it developed an interdependent relationship with U.S. investment. Okay, so in 1914, the British had invested about $2.5 billion. The U.S. was about $700 million. So And pretty soon the US began to um, invest more and more. And likewise, right, Americans own 30% of all Canadian industries. So they became interdependent. They became very connected, which is why the US and Canada, even today, still have very strong economic ties. Latin America, on the other hand, developed a dependent in economy. Latin America becomes dependent on foreign investment and on the power of the United States and Canada. Latin America doesn't undergo industrialization. That's the colonial legacy. Portugal and Spain hadn't provided many manufactured goods, unlike the British, who would set up factories in the United States and Canada. The Portuguese and the Spanish didn't see Latin America as a place to manufacture. They wanted the manufacturing to take place in their countries, and they used Latin America just for its resources. So the elites profited from trade, but they didn't invest that trade back into the local industry. They took that wealth to Europe. So Latin America is not industrializing as fast. The British also invest, but they invest very small because the Latin American markets are a lot smaller. Okay, industrialization was limited to just a few cities as opposed to the entire country. So, I mean, just to give you an example, I still remember when I was a kid going to visit my grandmother, having to use an outhouse, having to go to the bathroom outdoors in a, outdoor bathroom where there's just a big hole in the ground, because her town still had not had running water, or no sewer systems, I should say. They had running water, they had faucets you could turn on in the morning and they would shut them off at night. But that's in my lifetime, right? Where rural parts of Mexico still were not connected to modern infrastructure. So there were very small Latin American markets, so the investment was limited, and there was no desire by the British to make Latin America equal trading partners. They had equal trading partners in the US and Canada, but to make Latin America an equal trading partner would have been to invest way more money than they wanted to invest. Argentina develops a cattle ranching industry and it becomes a big source of beef for the world. And European immigrants are going to lead to population growth, and they're going to be providing the labor. There are attempts to industrialize. Porfirio Diaz in Mexico wanted to industrialize Mexico. He built railroads, but he built railroads that went from south to north. And he didn't build the railroads because Mexico didn't have a lot of money, and this was one of the causes of the revolution that I was mentioning in the last lecture. In order to build the railroads, Porfirio Diaz had to get American companies to come do the building. And so when he wanted to develop the mining industries and they didn't have the money or the technology, he invited American companies to come in and mine. And so the problem was Mexico had mines, but the mines were owned by Americans. And the top paying jobs went to American engineers and American miners. And the Mexican miners who worked in those mines got paid half of what the Americans would get paid. And the Mexicans were the ones that had to do the hard, dangerous work of setting, for example, the dynamite into the mines. So there was one of the preludes to the Mexican Revolution was the mining in Cananea, in Sonora, northern Mexico, where the Mexican workers went on strike because they wanted to be paid the same as the Americans. And in order to crush the strike, the Cananea Mining Company got permission from Porfirio Diaz to bring in the U.S. Army to crush the strike. And for the Mexican people, that was like one of the last straws that led to revolution. They saw it as, dude, the Mexican president allowed a foreign army to come in there to kill Mexican people. So the railroads, they were built, but they were built to extract Mexico's wealth and send it to the United States. He connected Mexico with telegraph lines. Like I said, mining industry surged, but they were in the hands of foreign investors. And he transforms Mexico City. Mexico City became a modern, beautiful city. In fact, he models the Boulevard de la Reforma, Mexico's main thoroughfare. He models it after the Champs-Élysées. So if you ever visit Mexico City and you ever visit Paris, you'll see similarities in these big boulevards with these roundabouts, these glorietas in the middle. But the wealth stayed in the hands of a very few and of foreign investors. Here's a picture of his 80th birthday celebration. And that was another one of the last straws that led to the Mexican Revolution. For his 80th birthday in 1910, Porfirio Diaz, he wanted to invite the world to show that Mexico was not a backward country. He wanted to show, look, we're just like a European country. So he threw a party for himself for his 80th birthday and to celebrate the 100th anniversary, the 100th birthday of Mexico, of the independence. And he had the police remove all the indigenous looking people from the middle of the city. He sent them to the outskirts of the city, and he didn't allow them to come in. Even people that had been loyal and friendly with him and his own friends and had served with him in like the military. They were kicked out of the city because they were too brown skinned. He used to powder his face white, and he sent his kids to study in France. So he was a mestizo, but he wanted to look European. And if you ever see pictures of Porfirio Diaz, you'll see him look very European in some pictures because he used to powder his face. And so in order to attract foreign investment, he wanted to make the city look wealthier and whiter. And that was another one of the things. That, along with the strikes and all the other corruption, is when Mexican people finally had enough and they began to revolt. Okay, so in conclusion, the economies expanded rapidly in the Americas, but the Latin American economies became dependent on foreign investment, and they were largely in the hands of foreigners. Latin American exports included like agricultural products, bananas, copper, silver, rubber, coffee, beef, wheat, tobacco, sugar, right? Mostly agricultural items that aren't big profit makers for the workers. They don't pay a lot. Decisions were also in the hands of foreigners, right? The governments were unstable and there was little they could do about it because the governments, they depended on these companies, right? They depended on foreign companies to run the economies. And these foreign companies also corrupted the Latin American governments. They bought them out. They paid off the elites. They worked with them. So Latin American societies were controlled by the elites who profited the most from the trade, but the people of Latin America did not. And those are problems that continue to the present day. Okay, so I'll just leave this last slide up so you can see these discussion questions. Try to be able to answer them. We may not get to them in class, but just for your checking of understanding. So in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the cultural and the social diversity, and that was section 3. So that's it for this lecture.